The Movie Preview Critic. Informing and entertaining your movie world.
Hello, good movie lovers, and welcome to Movie Night. This week, we're going to be watching Scream from 1996, directed by Wes Craven. So if you have the movie, please go ahead and have it ready in your DVD player. And once that menu screen pops up, don't hit play just yet. I want to just set down a few guidelines. As usual, when listening to a movie night, you should always watch the movie before so that you can kind of get the most out of it. And this movie night's going to be sort of a new style here at the Movie Preview Critic, where in the past, the movie nights have been really edited, so it's kind of just wall to wall commentary. And that's great because, just for myself, I put all the ideas that I could possibly have about the movie into as small amount a period of time as possible. But on the other hand, it just takes forever to edit that, which cuts down on the amount of movie nights that can be done. This way, I'm just going to be talking all the way straight through, no breaks, no editing. You'll probably notice a lot of pausing and some quiet moments, so don't think that I've walked away. It's just a gathering of thoughts taking place. And you'll probably notice that the movie nights are a little more laid back than the preview reviews or any of the other videos. They might be funny, they might not be, they might just be a little more serious. Just kind of whatever naturally comes up is going to be what comes up. So enjoy. And as always, please leave me your comments. I'm always looking to have that great feedback so I can evolve, improve, and grow. And one last thing to mention is that the discussion during this commentary is going to kind of be all over the place. It'll be a mix of analysis of what's going on in the moment of the scene, then maybe a discussion about the time of the movie, what was going on in cinema during that specific period, some discussion about the director, writers, actors, just kind of everything involved surrounding this film. So let's just go ahead and dive right into it. This movie's about 2 hours, so find a comfortable chair and press play. Dimension Film logo, that of course is part of the Miramax family back in the late 90s. Now Miramax is owned by Disney, and the Weinstein brothers, which pioneered Miramax and Dimension, are no longer with Miramax, and they've started their own company, the Weinstein Company. But at that time, Dimension was relatively new, and they were kind of specifically geared towards horror films, kind of this hip, sort of youthful demographic. And this movie just kicks right off. I love this. Just first scene, you get kind of the Scream title, and then, of course, the Scream effect. And boom, the phone rings, and you're just into it. Now, of course, this is a homage to the 1979 horror movie. Not so much like a bloody horror movie, but just like a thriller kind of a horror. When a Stranger Calls, starring Carol Kane, where it's most famous for that opening sequence where she's babysitting and she gets a phone call and someone's calling her. She calls the police, and eventually we have the great reveal that he's calling from inside the house, which actually was taken from the 1974 slasher pioneer Black Christmas. That's a Canadian film made by Bob Clark. If anyone knows the name Bob Clark, you might best know him for the Christmas classic Christmas Story with Ralphie and the Red Ryder BB gun. He also pioneered kind of the teen, gross out sex comedy genre with Porky's. I want to say that was 1980. So he really had a hand in a lot of original filmmaking. And Black Christmas, along with setting up this whole slasher point of view camera and the killer taking out people in one location, was really famous for having someone make these threatening phone calls to the main character. Now, when A Stranger Calls did it best, that's probably why it became so popular. Now, here Scream is just paying homage and taking it to the next level. Now, the great thing about Scream, let's set this up, that in 1996, the slasher genre was pretty much a joke. You had Black Christmas in 1974, Halloween 1978, then Friday the 13th in 1980. Those were like the three atomic bombs, especially Halloween and Friday the 13th, that just set off this ripple effect of slasher mania for basically 10 years until the end of the 80s. Where in 1990, you don't have a Friday the 13th movie every year. Um, Michael Myers is still making movies. I want to say they're coming out like every 2 or 3 years. But just that hyper production of films is just slow to a stop. The audience is really tired of them. They're not really profitable. And most importantly, they're cliche. In the recent Last House on the Left and Friday the 13th Part Remake preview reviews, I talked about this idea about a genre having a sort of life cycle where step one is it's something brand new. It just really shocks everyone. It's just a new, interesting, exciting experience. Then step two, you have a lot of reproduction. There's a hit. Studios just want a piece of that box office pie, so everyone starts making all these movies that are exactly like the one that was the huge hit. The third phase of this process is the burnout. There's so many of these movies made, and the genre conventions are so defined and just reused that audiences and even the filmmakers and the writers just get burned out totally, and these movies lose any kind of freshness. They get stale, which leads to the fourth phase, the final phase, which will basically be either dying off or coming back to life. You either refresh and reinvent yourself, figure out a way to go beyond the cliches, thinking of new innovations for the genre, and continue to live on, or you just fade away and become irrelevant. It was a nice fad that lasted for so many years, but its time has passed, and time is moving on, and it's a new generation, and we want a new kind of thrill at the movies. And this is the state of the slasher movie by the middle of the 90s. At this point, Pinhead's going into space. I actually saw that movie at the theater. I don't remember the name of the exact Hellraiser installment, but when you go in and there's like a spaceship turning into a Hellraiser cube, that it's not really going to be a great movie. Same thing with Leprechaun and Nightmare on Elm Street. But for Nightmare on Elm Street, we should mention that Wes Craven, of course, he's directing this, and that was just another genius move. We'll get into the whole... Scream is just referencing the history of the slasher movie in such a great way, even getting one of its founding directors to make it. But in 1994, I believe, Wes Craven made the seventh Nightmare on Elm Street, which was called The New Nightmare. And it sort of hinted at this tone that Scream would pick up on, this sarcasm, this kind of hip, self-referential, zeitgeist that was kind of in the air for, let's say, Generation X in the mid-90s. And The New Nightmare is kind of like a movie within a movie where Wes Craven and Heather Mellencamp, and I don't remember who played the father character, John something, the policeman father character in the first Nightmare on Elm Street and in the third one. He was actually also in Black Christmas as a policeman. But those characters are in there as themselves, as their real reality selves. They're just actors, and they start being terrorized by nightmares that Freddy might be real. And it's this whole self-referential, what's real, let's talk about horror movies kind of thing. And it kind of did the Scream thing first in a very little way. It kind of set this new idea out there that all the conventions had been done, and either we got to get rid of slasher films or something has to revitalize the genre. And that's Kevin Williamson coming along and writing just a really amazing script for Scream, making it fun and hip. I really want to call Scream kind of like the Pulp Fiction of the slasher genre, where Pulp Fiction in 1994 really just came along. I mean, we all know, right? It's a super classic movie. It made everyone stars. It revitalized John Travolta's career, made Sam Jackson into an icon, Quentin Tarantino into a mega super director star, which really had never happened before that, where he was basically a rock star with a camera instead of a guitar. But that really kind of loosened everyone up in terms of filmmaking. Things weren't so serious. You can really push boundaries. That whole GIMP sequence, and Pulp Fiction was just so imaginative and really took you to places that you had never been to before in movies. And it was just very exciting to watch in terms of movies can be fun. They can be inventive and exciting and not a predictable experience where if filmmakers and studios are just using these conventions of each genre just like a blueprint, you show up to any movie and you're like, okay, here's where the good good guy's wife gets kidnapped, and now he's got to go find her and the face off with the bad guy. Pulp Fiction and those early 90s independent cinema films like Clerks, Slacker, they really just took you to places where you had never been before. And that's Pulp Fiction was kind of the culmination of that movement, and it just really made independent cinema mainstream. And Scream in the same way just kind of just destroyed all the previous notions of the slasher genre and picked up on that hipness from Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction just totally rocked the world, and it really defined just like that Generation X culture, like everyone who was 12 to 25 to 30 at that time. It was just like Pulp Fiction was the coolest thing to be into. And now you had to be sarcastic and a little cynical, and it just really started to define that. Where like this 1950s sort of, the early 80s had like this 1950s sort of thing going on where, you know, they're hungry for like American Graffiti and looking back to the past with there's a Lawrence Kasdan movie, The Big Chill, where they talk about the 50s and the 60s, especially the 60s, where it's like the dreams of the peace revolution, all that kind of stuff. And there's a certain naivety going around where it's like whatever authority says we believe. But now in the 90s, it's just like start to doubt everything, start to rip on everything. And whether it's disappointment, like some sort of unconscious disappointment from the 60s, seeping into the collective unconscious of this new generation. I don't want to get too esoteric here with these ideas, but it really kind of does fuel a generation in some way that they may not know, where why is Generation X this hugely cynical and sarcastic generation, especially back then? That's the same generation that gave birth to The Daily Show and The Onion newspaper. So you have just this culture of sarcasm and just, listen, whatever older people say or whatever authority says we don't believe in, and we're just going to make fun of it because we're disappointed. And it almost seems like there's no point in hoping for something good to come out of things or promises to be kept because everyone disappoints. You have Nixon in the 70s with Watergate, and it's just like this constant string of disappointments. Ronald Reagan and the whole Iran-Contra scandal, and then even a couple years after Scream in 1998, you have the whole Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky gate. So enough of that, but there's just this whole sarcastic kind of we're hip, we're smarter than you, but we don't believe in your dreams and your lies and your, BS. So let's get back into the scene right here, because it's just an amazing opening for a horror movie where you just had the quizzing on the phone. It's just a reference to all the past classic slashers with Halloween, and of course the Friday the 13th question that when I was in the theater, I was like 19 when I saw this, so I'm giving my age away there a little bit. And a huge horror fan. I really grew up with all the Jason movies and everything. And I was, along with everyone else, just screaming out, Jason, Jason, that's the answer. But he gets you on that trick question where he didn't specify which Friday the 13th, and of course in the first movie, it's Jason's mom who's the killer. And that's sort of like the metaphor for the rest of the film, where we're in the audience, we're thinking, we already know all the answers, we know where this is going. And the minute you're like, wow, okay, I didn't know that answer, and he fakes her out, you know this movie's going to start faking you out non-stop. And here is a perfect example where it's basically a homage to, it's a callback to 1960s Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, where midway through that movie, the main character, played by Janet Leigh, gets knocked off. She gets killed. And that had really never happened before, and that totally shocked audience. But that was at least, let's say, like 60 minutes into the film. It was in the middle. Here, it's happening within the first 10 minutes, and it's Drew Barrymore. So she was definitely a well-known name back in the mid-90s. She was totally a big star in the early 80s with E.T. and Firestarter. Then she kind of slipped in terms of popularity, but in the early 90s she got her career going again, and she was starting to be a big name. And here, we're just sitting in the audience thinking, okay, there's no way Drew Barrymore is going to die. Especially here with this little sequence where she runs out and you see a car coming. You're just thinking, okay, she's going to flag down the car, they're going to see her, and there's going to be a way she's going to survive. But no, and there's just this great shot where the camera's right on her, and you see the knife going in. And even in the Friday the 13th movies, like let's say Part 4, Part 7, Part 9, those are probably like the most bloody of the installments, and you start to see like this penetration of the weapon. But here it's just so unexpected and really shocking. Because again, it's a big name actress, and you're absolutely not expecting it. And this opening sequence just sets up the rest of the movie, and it gets all of us to break our cynicism and kind of our sarcastic little attitude of, okay, I know what this movie's going to be doing. And now you don't know where it's going. And that's the most exciting thing, at least for me, going into a theater and expecting one thing, thinking I'm smarter than this movie, and all of a sudden it just takes you places where you're just like, okay, I give up, just take me along with you. And here, look at this scene here, this moment. The mom goes outside, and just for good measure, the killers have hung her up and gutted her. And it's just like, wow, okay, let's pay attention from now on. So just in that opening sequence, that first 10 to 12, 13 minutes there's just a reference to a slew of classic slasher films. And that was really never done before in terms of films. Like, characters really never knew that they were in the movie. They didn't know about horror movies. Not that they didn't know that they were in a horror movie, but they didn't know that the conventions of the horror film existed. And that's what this script was so great about doing. There's going to be that classic scene later with Jamie Kennedy where he says, "You don't know the rules? Well, here's the rules to surviving a slasher movie." And he just lists them one by one. And all those rules are played upon throughout this film. Here we just had a great scene which is a little homage to Nightmare on Elm Street, where you have the Billy character coming through the window, played by Skeech Ulrich, who this was really like one of his first major roles. In terms of being a movie fan and knowing actors, I didn't really know who he was, and that's could be said for a lot of people in this cast. This movie also really pioneered a lot of what was to come for the next 4 to 5 years in terms of horror movies, with like this rejuvenation that has started, but we'll talk about that in a second. We'll talk about the cast. But the homage through the window, that's from the first Nightmare on Elm Street, where the Johnny Depp character, I don't remember his name, comes to visit Nancy in her house, and he does a similar sort of thing. Now, on the commentary to this movie, I listened to it a couple days back. Pretty great to take a listen to because it's Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson. It was recorded only like a couple months after the movie was made, while it was still in theaters, and as they were starting to make the sequel. So you really get a cool sense of what they were thinking at the time they were making this. Believe it or not, this is kind of scary. It's already 13 years since this movie came out. Is that right? 1996, 2006 is 10 years? Yeah, wow. Okay. Time is flying. Okay, so 13 years ago, Scream came out. So that commentary is just a real nice time capsule of what they were trying to do in terms of breaking the cliches and turning everything on its head and revitalizing this genre. But they talk about a lot of these things, so I don't really want to be ripping off their comments, but I did learn a lot from it, and I might be borrowing some facts here and there, but definitely take a listen to that commentary. It's filled with a lot of directing and writing insight and behind-the-scenes stories. But here, of course, is a cliche of the slasher genre where you have the virgin who usually survives the movie. If you go back to any of the classic slasher films, the girls may not be virgins, but they do not have sex while they're in the movie. During their time in the story, they never commit that sin. And I've talked about in a lot of the preview reviews, especially at the beginning of this year, having done the My Bloody Valentine, Last House on the Left, and the Friday the 13th reviews, kind of like a horror trilogy review. Done a lot of talking about the whole idea that slasher films were born from like this unconscious, subconscious rage or something within the older traditional mentalities that the late 60s kind of destroyed, or let's say turned those traditions on their heads. In a way, they were kind of revitalizing the old notions of how people were supposed to act and what rules of behavior people were supposed to follow in order to keep society quote-unquote civilized. So were the slashers of those 70s and 80s movies sort of like these parental figures punishing teens for indulging in these forbidden areas of humanity? Maybe, maybe not. But here it's set up that Neve Campbell is the virginal character and she doesn't give herself up to Billy here. And here, Wes Craven talks about on the commentary that they purposely don't show any nudity in this movie because that's a way of turning the cliches on their head. Because in all slasher films, the classic 80s slasher movies, that was a genre set piece. You went to see these movies because you were going to see nudity, drinking, sex, drugs, violence, blood. Those were the reasons you went. So Scream is ushering in this new kind of mentality in terms of the slasher filmmaking where you're not going to show nudity. And throughout the rest of the 90s, when you have movies like Urban Legends and I Know What You Did Last Summer, those movies are not going to show nudity. Also, for another reason, because the stars that are in those films are not no names anymore. If you go back to Halloween, Friday the 13th, Terror Train, even though Terror Train had Jamie Lee Curtis from Halloween, but all those kind of small slasher films, they don't have big name stars. They don't have TV stars now who have established themselves in other areas of media and entertainment going into the film medium and showing their skin. That's just not done, because back then even the idea of being a film star and a TV star were really two separate worlds, where being a movie star was really highly respected, and if you worked in TV, you kind of were just thought of as like a lower class of actor. We're like, why would I want to do TV? I'm in the movies. And the dream of every TV star was to make that transition into film. But again, going from kind of the small screen to the big screen, that was a little bit tougher because you had kind of a bias against you. That goes back even to the 50s, where there was the threat that when TV came out or became popular and started to just be in every home, that it was really a deadly threat to the film medium. So movies had to create CinemaScope and 3D and smell-o-vision and just all these incentives for people to go to the theater. Kind of what we're facing today. The past has kind of come back again, where now everyone's talking about doing 3D movies because of DVD rentals and people just waiting for the DVDs to come out at the stores. Right now, going to the theater costs about $10 to $12, and that's what DVDs are costing. Now, with Blu-rays, the prices are going to go up, so you might not be getting your money's worth to buy a $30 Blu-ray instead of going to the theater where you can see the movie for 10 or 20 bucks, depending if you're with someone. But that whole idea of TV as this enemy of film really carried it over in terms of a mentality into the 80s. By the 90s, where you have kind of like corporations and just this whole, let's call it like a synergy, or just everything coming together, where you have corporations buying out other corporations and just mergers nonstop. What do they call this? It's a vertical integration, where now a company owns a music chapter, a book chapter, the TV, just every single kind of medium is owned by a larger parent company. And now, of course, they want to integrate all their products within all those different media. So if you have Jennifer Lopez in the late 90s, let's say, I don't really remember who she was making music for, but let's just say it's Sony Music. And she has an album coming out, so why don't they pull some strings and get her to be a movie star? And I remember her being on David Letterman one episode, I don't even know what year this was, 2000, 99, 1998, somewhere around there, but that week she had the #1 album and the #1 movie, which had never been done before. In the 80s, I think Michael J. Fox had the #1 TV show and the #1 movie. It was like Teen Wolf and Family Ties. Don't ask me why I know that. I'm a huge fan of Family Ties. Teen Wolf was pretty cool, but you go back and watch it now and it's just like, geez, this is really outdated. But that really didn't happen so frequently, because you had these companies still very separate, like in the 70s and 80s, but by the 90s, everyone's just coming together. So a star of a movie is on that corporation's magazine company's cover. So you have Matthew McConaughey in this movie, and he's on the cover of Entertainment Weekly, which is owned by this company, and just everyone's together, and stars are really starting to bleed into all the different mediums. So someone's on TV and now they're in a movie. So this Scream really set that standard. When you go back and look at horror movie posters back in the 80s, especially let's stick with the slasher genre, it's really just the killer. It's the pumpkin face and a knife for the Halloween poster, or maybe the main character from Nightmare on Elm Street with the claw above her, or Freddy, he's the main draw. But after Scream, you start to get these group photos. And, the whole Dawson's Creek phenomenon, which is Kevin Williamson's creation 2 years later after this movie. We'll talk about that in a second. But you get this whole idea that now it's just this ensemble cast of hip young teens, which have been established in other genres and other different entertainment endeavor. So Nev Campbell was really big from Party of Five, which had started in 1994. So that had become a hit show along with, I want to say, Melrose Place was on Fox, Beverly Hills 90210. So it was like this trilogy of predecessors to what the CW has nowadays. So she was a big star there. And then the other one, of course, Drew Barrymore, we know she was a movie star. But who was the other TV star? Oh, Courtney Cox, who was on Friends at the time. Friends had also started, I want to say, in 1994, and by 96, it's a certifiable hit. It had that freshman year, sophomore year of 95, so by 96, it's officially like a cultural phenomenon. So to have Courtney Cox and Nev Campbell in this movie, it's a way to drag fans from those shows and make them audience members of this movie. Now, this is a really great point in the story here, where you have her in the house by herself. It's been a couple minutes since any real killing tension has gone on, and she just took the bag out of the closet, so you know there's no one in there. Now, in a couple minutes, you're going to get a little scare from that. So I just love the way that Scream does this. And we have some backstory here about the killings that are going on, and you start to get this little hint that she doesn't like Gail. Courtney Cox is the news reporter, because there's a past history here of having investigated Sydney's mom's murder, and the suspicion that the person Sydney pointed the finger at as the killer was not true. So Sydney has just kind of like this hostility towards Gail. But just to finish up the point really quick about the stars, having TV stars now in the movies and slasher films, it's really not a good idea for their careers to flash the nudity. So you kind of hit it on 2 points. The one point is that it's flipping the conventions of the genre in terms of, in the past they showed everything, now we're going to hold back. So the audience now is saying, well, okay, I was expecting this and I didn't get it. And on the other level, we're keeping the purity of the actor's persona that they've established in the TV show, and here in the feature film they haven't ruined their kind of wholesome image, because of course on TV you can't show any rated R stuff. Now here we're about to start the next beat of the story. I've talked about beats before in past commentaries. Basically, think of a beat of a movie as kind of like a chapter, where it is, I want to call it an event or decision, where if it's a decision, it's created by the main character. They're deciding to do something, and that decision is going to create a series of scenes that are going to lead them to pursuing a goal or just for something to happen. And in terms of an event, it's usually something that happens that's out of their control. In this case, the killer, the opponent, in general in any kind of movie, the opponent does something that makes the main character react, and a bunch of scenes are going to result from that. So here a new chapter is going to start. Think of a beat or a chapter in terms of the DVD chapters, the scene selection, where when you go through, every movie tends to have between 18 and 26 of them, and they're all lasting maybe 2 to 3 to 5, 6 minutes. So on the DVD, if you look at this, it might be called Sydney's First Encounter or Sydney's Turn, something like that. And here she gets the phone call. This phone call is such an awesome device in the movie, and the voice is so creepy because it's human. Later we're going to find out, of course, it's like some voice box, but I just love the sound of it. We're like, especially in the opening scene, where at first it's so friendly, just, oh, hey, I called the wrong number. And you might think it's just some sleazy guy trying to pick up on the girl that he accidentally called. And then it just has that great kind of primal evil to it, where it just switches its tone, and just kind of like this creature comes out of pure evil. I love it. And here's a great example. Sydney's attitude is that whole kind of youth generation X attitude of, what is this, a scary movie? Okay, I'm home by myself. And she's calling out all the conventions that we in the audience already know. So it's a way of her saying that, okay, audience, we know what you're thinking, and we're going to go against that. And she's just being really cocky and sarcastic to the person on the phone. And we know, of course, this is the real person because we've heard the voice in the opening sequence. And now it gets kind of scary for her. The music cues are really nice here. They're just very sparse and kind of peppered just to heighten our growing fear. I love the line here where she says, okay, so who are you? And he says, the question's not who am I, but where am I? You kind of have to have that in movies in general. I know it's kind of forced and it almost seems packaged a little bit too neatly, but just having a nice catchphrase like that, just a nice summation of an idea of a mood at the moment, it just really works well. So, and it really gets you creeped out. I mean, back in 96, cell phones weren't insanely popular. They were starting to make the rounds and become an everyday item, but there's no way that fifth graders had them yet. You had to wait till the 2000s for that. So the idea of someone calling you on your home phone, it's just funny today that a lot of people don't even have home phones. Just a line for their modem and a cell phone. But just the idea of someone calling you in the middle of the night, it probably still holds true today. I mean, if someone would call you and just tell you these kind of things, you'd get freaked out. So this was a convention that was just used at the beginning of when a stranger calls, and here it's just really effectively taken to the next level. And this scene here is another turn on the cliche, where the woman gets the threatening call, and number one, the turn on the cliche is that she's not scared. She's not putting her hands up to her mouth and, teeth are chattering and she's scared. She opens the door, which is another violation of slasher code, slasher genre rules, where the killer says, I'm either at the front door or the back door. And Cindy says, okay, I'm going to call your bluff. And she opens the front door. The minute that front door opened, everyone in the theater is just expecting the killer to pop through. And when the killer doesn't, and she walks out on the porch, there's just that other level of fear of like, okay, now where's the killer going to pop out from? And that whole just minute of her on the phone is just so much tension. And that a great moment there where the killer switches the voice again. That's really taken from Black Christmas, where the killer at the beginning seems kind of nice and normal, and just like this insane craziness, it's almost like a multiple personality just kind of pops out of the voice. And even in, let's say, the most recent example, that would be The Dark Knight, where you have the Joker in that one scene where he's got the camera on the wannabe Batman, the vigilante wannabe, and he says, look at the camera, look at me. Just kind of just taps into that insane part of his soul. And here a great, pop out from behind Sydney where she left the door open so that you could just imagine the killer snuck in as she was walking around the corner, and then he comes out of the closet from behind her, so we see him first, so that scares us. And then when she turns around, we feel her fear with her at that moment. And here we have some primitive internet action going on, and in the background, just having him whip his hand with the knife through the door. That's just awesome tension, just really well done. But watching her type the 911 call on the computer, it's kind of laughable, because again, it's 13 years old, and it's just funny to see how the computer looks. It's kind of like looking at war games nowadays. It almost feels like you're watching the Flintstones use a computer. They're so out of date, and the change happens so fast nowadays. So here he drops the phone, and this is a great, great story point. On the commentary, Kevin Williamson talks about the need to create the doubt in the audience's mind, where slowly everyone in the movie is going to become a suspect. Everyone, of course, except Sydney. You don't really know who this killer is, and it's going to lead, of course, to the ultimate surprise where it's two killers working together. We'll talk about that when, of course, that happens. Here's this nice little scene where Dewey, the policeman, has the mask, and you think it's him for a moment. So just these quick little cuts, just these little bites of terror, these frightening little moments where you think this is going to be kind of a comedic, sarcastic movie, and it really does scare you. And in terms of the slasher movie that's being aped here, or given homage in terms of the structure of the multiple would-be killers that are around that we don't know who is the real killer and there's doubt in our minds, you have to go back to Prom Night. The original Prom Night, not the recent remake, which I didn't see, so I don't know if they kept that whole idea of a mysterious killer that everyone's a suspect. But here, Prom Night, the structure is used where in that one you think it's the janitor, you think it's the sister, you think it's the jock. You don't really know who the killer is in that one until, of course, the surprise ending. So they try to get that going here. And pay attention to the names and just like little references here that are used. The name of Billy, his last name is Billy Loomis, and that is a reference to Donald Pleasance as Dr. Loomis back in Halloween, the original. So a nice little callback. It had to be a lot of fun to write this movie, especially if you're a horror fan. You just look back at 20 years. At this point, 1996, it basically would be about 20 years of the slasher genre. And just watch all your favorite movies and just kind of sum up what's gone on in them. And every cliche, every genre set piece that we know. And now to just twist it around. That must have been so much fun. A brilliant idea. Now today, it almost seems just like a natural instinct where especially with internet hosting video sites where anyone can make a video, the demand to be original and to stand out from just the sea of entertainment that's out there, the bar has been raised. And since we always learn by what's been done in the past, this idea of kind of a hip take on old cliches, where Scream isn't necessarily like a spoof, it's not a scary movie spoof, it's just more of a hip, self-referential, teens that are smart and aware of all these conventions kind of movie, instead of making fun of all of these genre set pieces and ideas. So because there's so much entertainment and so much creativity just pouring forth with all these different portals of viewing possibility, whether it's on TV, on cable, at the theater, or on the internet, ideas like this don't come around that often. Nowadays it's almost planned in the schedule. You can kind of just imagine like at these meetings at studios where executives or whoever organizes these things over there, they have this big calendar for 2 or 3 years, and they say, okay, well, the torture porn genre is officially popular, so we can expect to make 10 variations on that for the next 4 quarters, and then the audience should be tired at that time, and we'll officially start parodying them. Get Scary Movie 7 ready to exclusively make fun of the torture porn genre. Now, hopefully it's not to that mathematically planned and scheduled level, but sometimes you kind of feel it is. I mean, where you have, what was it, Disaster Movie that just came out, and within Disaster Movie, they're already making fun of movies that aren't even on DVD yet, or just have hit the theaters. Hancock and Iron Man. I mean, at least give us time to soak those into our culture and define the sort of memorable movie moments that are gonna be recognizable within the parody. The great thing about parodies is that they make fun of those moments that have kind of become just locked in our movie memories. Just when you think of a movie, when you think of Wizard of Oz, you think of Dorothy clicking her heels together, or the flying monkeys, or the tornado with the house. These images that just stick out from the rest of the movie. So these parodies are just taking trailer moments. Of course a trailer is going to pick the scenes from the movie it thinks are going to be the most recognizable and memorable ones, but you can never predict that stuff, because we, the audience, have our own sensibilities, and kind of together we decide what really rocks in any given movie. Where you could take the There Will Be Blood from a couple years back, and who knew that I Drink Your Milkshake would become this pop culture phenomenon. It's getting back to the moment of the story. So that beaten sequence has ended. That chapter of this cinematic book is over, where the attack at Sydney's house happens. And it was really thrilling. Remember that moment where he's running up the stairs after her in the theater? I just remember thinking to myself, like, wow, this is pretty great. I was pretty tense at that moment, because especially back then you had really never seen a killer, especially a slasher killer, be so aggressive, which again was another spin on the old cliches, on those old slasher conventions. And you can kind of say that Scream hinted at the super fast zombie, which would revolutionize that zombie genre with 28 Days Later and the Dawn of the Dead remake, and it's kind of seeped into the slasher remakes, where now you have Leatherface moving a little bit faster, and Friday the 13th, where Jason now is officially joined a gym and apparently training for the Olympics or something, because he can jump onto the roof of a cabin in like less than a second. So really want to say that Scream was responsible for that, because never before had a killer moved so fast in a movie, or at least a popular movie. So this, again, set yet another new standard. And that's really, if we can just kind of talk, oh, here's a great moment. I wanted to get into something, but just this part here where the main heroine, right, the would-be survivor that we are pretty sure is going to survive, but with Scream you can never really know if you've never seen it before, punches the reporter in the face. Just another great moment, kind of, again, that Generation X punch to authority of, like, grown-ups, we don't really believe what you say, and we're tired of hearing your BS and believing it and being disappointed. So now everything is just cynical and sarcastic. And Scream really balances that well, where you have the comedy coming from the sarcasm and just really kind of the semi-goofy characters. And it balances comedy with the horror. Now, on the commentary with Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson, they talk about how a lot of potential directors for this movie wanted to approach it as more of a spoof, as more of a comedic slasher film. But Wes Craven came along and talked with the Weinsteins and Kevin Williamson, and they all agreed that it should definitely try to terrorize and be a horror film that with moments, kind of these light comedic moments. And Wes Craven, from the beginning of his horror career, had done things like that, maybe a little unevenly at times. The best example would be the original Last House on the Left, where you have these goofy police officers cutting to these kind of bumbling cops, and then cutting back to this just totally horrific, murder of these two girls in that movie. It's just really maybe an uneven balance, but just flashes of what would come later. Now here's another great moment here. You gotta keep your opponent active in any kind of movie. Just if we're talking about screenplay structure, you never want to have the main character too in control of their decision making, or you don't want to have things be too easy for them. There always has to be a constant threat going on, whether you're making a drama, an action movie, whatever it is. Especially in a horror movie, you always want to know that the killer's around somewhere, that threat is always around. And that scene there also really worked well to establish Dewey as a potential killer, because he's in his room when the phone call is being made, and he comes out only after the phone is hung up. So you think, well, he could have a cell phone, or there might be some way that he's making those phone calls. So yet another threat is established that he might be the killer. And here we have this whole idea about the media, just this constant, televisions are everywhere here. And especially with Gale playing the reporter, it's almost a very similar character to the Nicole Kidman character in To Die For, which was a Gus Van Sant sort of satirical look at the news tabloids, which today we really don't have too much, or maybe have taken over mainstream news. You'd have to kind of go back and look at what news was like, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, and look at news today, and you might say that tabloid journalism kind of won out, and it's more the norm, instead of like these sleazy midnight shows that you had to wait up to watch. Back in the day, there was a show called Hard Copy. I'm pretty sure it's not on anymore, but that used to cover just all the kind of seedy murder sort of stories, very similar to what's going on here. And To Die For really spoofed that whole genre about just wanting to be a celebrity and covering news and just going at all costs to become the center of attention. Whether you get that in a healthy, natural way, in a kind of good-hearted, let's call it spiritual way, or just a manipulative, greedy, sort of egotistical kind of motivated way. So this movie also hit upon that late 90s just desire to become the center of your own little reality show, which was happening through the news. Today, of course, we have reality TV everywhere, but back then it was almost like the tabloid TV was reality TV. And this is also kind of, again, another turn on the genre head, a battling against the cliche where in past slasher films you really didn't have in-depth stories for the main characters. The main character back in the original slasher movies was the killer. So you had Jason, Freddy, Michael Myers, all those guys. That was the person you really wanted to follow. You didn't really want to know anything about this girl who's going to survive, or the girl who's going to flash us her boobs, or the guy who's going to try to get lucky or bring the kegger to the party. None of those people really had in-depth backgrounds, emotions. You really didn't get into their characters, and the actors weren't really given a chance to flesh out any kind of characterization and emotion and get us involved with them on that kind of a level. But here, it's again another kind of sign of the times that we want that. We want to take this genre to the next level. So once you get actors that are established, they're going to be wanting to require some more things in terms of their characters, because just in general, when an actor gets involved with any kind of project, they're really approaching it at two levels. First, what can they add to their body of work, to their resume that, okay, yes, I'm Tom Cruise and I did a movie with Stanley Kubrick. That's great. That totally adds to padding my resume and I look like I'm a more serious actor. Leonardo DiCaprio, working with Martin Scorsese or Ridley Scott. Boom. It's just like, wow, it just really shows that I have skills, and respected directors making, let's say, respected projects want me involved with that. So it really just ups your stock in terms of Hollywood stock. And then on the other hand, you want to maintain with the audience sort of that persona. Are you a nice guy? I want to see a Tom Hanks movie. Imagine Tom Hanks starring as the Kevin Spacey character in Seven. That would absolutely have destroyed the whole Forrest Gump kind of nice guy, great actor persona that he had. He could have probably really rocked that role. He would have done a great job, but it's not what Tom Hanks wants to do. It's not the persona that he wants to continue the audience to think about him as having. Where here you have all these TV stars kind of taking a risk, where it's like, hey, I'm established already in this really popular series, so why do I want to risk my popularity by starring in this movie that might take into a new dimension in terms of perceiving an actor? So that's always risky. So on the one hand, it helps the slasher genre that now you're having respectable, established actors, proven actors wanting to be in these films, because hopefully the characters that they're portraying are a little more in-depth and we can kind of relate to them better than Victim 1, Victim 2. And here, Sydney's backstory is really uncharacteristic for any kind of slasher movie from the past. It really never happened that way before. So this whole thing about her mother, who she thinks is kind of like this holy woman, right? She wouldn't be a tramp, but everyone knows she was kind of sleeping around and brutal murder and all this kind of stuff, and she's still affected by that. So you've never seen stuff like that before. So really, again, a great job in terms of the writing and just the concept of this. It's also great in terms of the costume that the killer has here, right? They eventually called it the Scream mask, but wasn't it the Ghost? I think back when this mask has been around a long time. And it's kind of, again, another knock on the cliches, where before, every slasher movie tried to have like these specialized killers. Like, if you watch the slasher documentary Going to Pieces, the rise and fall of the slasher film, I believe is the full title. If you watch that, there's this one producer from My Bloody Valentine, and he talks about how back then everyone was just thinking about, okay, well, you've got the mask killer, you've got a Jason Voorhees hockey mask, and so now we have to think of just some kind of gimmick, what job has a mask, can it be a mailman, or how about a miner? So for that movie they chose the miner because he had the pickaxe and had kind of this whole gimmick going on. So Scream is really great because it takes something that's just so generalized and available everywhere. So it took something that was so general and that everyone recognized, and it made it now kind of the specific mask of the killer. And this scene here is great. We have, of course, the Fonz, Henry Winkler, as the principal, and the two kids here. This is a really nice little sneaky way to reveal the ending of the movie for us, where you have both of these kids, these guys, wearing the mask, kind of going through the hallways scaring everyone as a prank, and they just got expelled for it. But the important thing about that scene is that it's two teenagers, two males, who are wearing the mask, and they're kind of doing it together. So that's a total just little foreshadowing about the end of the film. Now, in the commentary with Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven, they don't mention that, but I'm pretty positive that that had to be done for that reason. It's just a nice little... You can go back and watch this movie. That's another great thing about this film, is that it's so layered in terms of just the story structure, where you can watch it 2 or 3 times and get something new from it every time. So today, whenever there's any kind of discussions about, well, slasher movies or horror movies just in general, they're just there to scare you, and it should just be blood, guts, nudity, whatever, teens having fun, and just follow the conventions and don't give us anything too original. Don't go too out of the box. Just give us what we want and we'll be fine. And that's fine. You can do that, but again, you have human beings in the movie and you have human beings watching the movie, so why not just make them fully human? Why not give those different levels, and why not create a story that has a pretty interesting fabric to it, where you can kind of go back and see something different every time? That's pretty exciting, instead of just giving us some generic stuff that you watch once and throw out, where it's like fast food. Give us some gourmet dishes that we want to take home and eat later, savor again. Or maybe when we're eating it the first time, we want to really, just savor every moment, every bite of it. Here's a great example that the classic style of horror, the classic way to scare people in a movie, always works no matter the generation. You can go back to just the old days of Nosferatu, where it's just a door slowly opening or the camera kind of slowly in a room circling around it, and we don't know where the killer is. You don't need the ultimate gore, um, the highest kind of visual sensory input. You can just scare us with the basic cut, 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 from one shot. We see her face, we see the stalls, we do a close up of her face. Now we're going to see her go look under the stalls, and that's just creating enough tension. We're creating that tension, of course, with the help of the editing, but it works. Add a little bit of creepy music, and whether it's 1996, 2006, or 1906, it's going to work. The classic steps always work. And here's a great, great shot where you have the shoes coming down, and you're like, okay, and then the cape comes down, or the wizard's cape, whatever it is, the ghost cape. It's perfect. It really works. And you give the main character, Sydney, a little bit of active action here where she has to slide under him. And that's just so great. Another twist on the cliche is that Sydney never really trips in this movie. In the classic horror films, anytime a girl's running, right, we all know this, if she's in the woods or wherever, she's got to trip to give the killer a chance to catch her. And here, you don't really see that, I don't believe, from any characters. So that's just a perfect example where she's more of like a I don't know, some kind of commando sliding under and opening the door and faking the killer out. And that's another twist on the cliche. This movie just keeps on doing them, where this masked killer, he is fast, but he's also a little bit clumsy. He constantly is missing his targets. He's getting hit in the face. He's getting bruised. He's not sort of this omnipotent character where like Jason in the woods, where no matter where anyone runs, Jason knows every single hiding spot. He's going to find you. And he knows the shortcut. He's going to get there before they do. Here, the killer's just a regular person, so that probably helps the believability of it all, where he's not a resurrected zombie, corpse, spiritual, supernatural sort of hyper-powered being or something like that. It's not Pinhead from Hell or Chucky as a human spirit put into a doll, reincarnated into another form. So it's just a guy, and with a guy you can run faster than him, and you can throw beer bottles at him, and it's going to hurt him. And I like these little moments too, where when this killer behind the costume gets hit with things, or is running after someone, he's grunting and groaning. He might be getting a little tired. So all of that put together makes us feel like it's something new, and as a result, we're paying more attention, and we're interested. And here Gail's talking to Dewey, trying to get the dirt on the details that the police have. And it's almost a little rundown of, okay, who so far do we think are the suspects here? Where she doesn't point out Dewey, but we kind of think, okay, Dewey might be one. It doesn't really ever come across that Gail is a suspect, so pretty much her and Sydney are the two that are immune from any suspicion. And just a little side note here, right, we have Courtney Cox and David Arquette, who later would get married, so this was the film that brought them together. Let's talk about Matthew Lillard's character here. Matthew Lillard, I don't really remember him in any movies before Scream. He probably, like any actor, started out with commercials or little roles in smaller films, but this was really his breakout role. And this persona that he has, kind of this, I don't know, party guy, goofball, clowny, kind of Jim Carrey, ADD sort of Generation Xer. I don't know if it totally holds up 13 years later. Like if you watch it, you kind of might be thinking, wow, this is the equivalent of watching a movie from the 60s and people saying, far out, man, or that's really boss, going back to the 50s. His reactions are kind of played out. Even I think that term, played out, might be played out. So it was a big hit, though. Back then, this really catapulted him, and as a result, he had a pretty busy career for the next 2 or 3 years. I want to talk about the Fonz for a moment. Really quickly on the commentary with Kevin Williamson and Wes Craven. I hope I don't have to pay them some royalties for referencing their commentary. But Kevin Williamson talks about how he got the note back from Harvey Weinstein, or the Weinstein brothers, saying that there's about 30 minutes of the script where there's no kill. And this scene was added in where the principal would be knocked off because, again, just as mentioned earlier, you want to have an opponent active in a movie. Again, whether it's an action movie, drama, or horror. You don't ever want the audience to forget about them, and you want the audience to constantly be feeling like this level of threat that no one is safe at any time. Now, up to this point, The principal character has been. Oh, wait, really quick, that's an awesome shot. Did you see that janitor right there? That was Wes Craven, and he was wearing the Freddy Krueger sweater. So we have a little cameo in-joke reference to one of the classic mid-'80s slasher films. So that was a nice little moment. Actually got a big laugh in the theater. I remember seeing that. But here, the principal character has been suspected as maybe, hey, he's the killer. We kind of see him disappear at a couple of moments. Oh, here's another great example of the classic hand reaching for the door. We have the mirror in use, right? So all these elements of previous slasher and just horror movies in general are being used. And watching this, you're tense. You know, the music's coming up at the right time, and just that hand reaching for the door, it's like, okay, I'm scared. You kind of fight yourself, and you're like, oh, I've seen this before, but you still get jolted. And here, love this moment when he closes the door and Ghostface is behind the door. I think at that point the audience assumes the room is pretty safe because all the different areas have been kind of checked out by him. And if you're not paying attention enough, you totally get a little jolt from this scene because he just pops out behind that door. And a very artsy, stylistic shot there with the close-up of the eye and the Ghostface Scream Killer reflection showing up. But up to that point, the principal character was considered a suspect, but of course he's not anymore. Now, as mentioned, Kevin Williamson had to get notes for that moment because there was no murder going on for like 30 pages of the script. It does feel a little bit forced. It does kind of come back into play later when they announce that the principal's tied up at a goalpost and the house clears out. But up to this point, the killers have been following these established horror movie slasher rules, so why would the principal die? How is he connected to the motivation of the killers? And most importantly, he's not a teenager. But then again, in other slasher films, you do have occasionally parents and most usually teachers or counselors who are, unluckily just happen to be at the location where these murders are taking place. They become victims. But it's very rare that the adults become victims in slasher films. So one example is kind of forced in, but again, it keeps us in terror and it keeps us aware that this killer is out there. Here on the porch, we have the Rose McGowans. This scene here, okay, the porch scene just ended, and we have, that's kind of goofy, we have Ghostface Scream Guy in the background in the trees. Watching them have their conversation, that was unnecessary. We just had him kill the principal, so we know he's around. And right now, watching this movie, we know that it's two killers. So one was at the school and the other one was watching in the woods, but he didn't go into the house later, so what's the purpose for that? But whatever, it just keeps us in a little bit of a state of anxiety. But that scene on the porch is really important because it mentions a real-life reference where these kids are a part of our reality, where they talk about Richard Gere and a gerbil. So go ahead and internet search it. I don't want to describe the urban legend, the late 90s urban legend or mid 90s urban legend about that. But if you're interested, just go find out about that. But for this story, it's really important because, again, this is one of the first horror films, the slasher films, to be referencing things that are going on in the audience's universe, where in the past people were just in their own world, and it kind of took place in some halfway point between our reality. It's just people in a reality that kind of looked like ours, but never really referenced the exact same things. But I can remember, like in Nightmare on Elm Street Part 4 at the beginning, one of the kills, which is a Freddy's glove popping out of the mattress, takes out this character, Joey, kind of a reference to Nightmare on Elm Street Part 1, but he's watching MTV. So things like that didn't really happen a lot in horror films, and Scream just took it to the next level where the kids are just like us. They're aware of everything that's going on. They're making references to things that we know, so it just feels all the more real. Now here might be one of the best moments of the movie where we have the video store and Jamie Kennedy as the video clerk. And this scene really ties in, let's say, I don't want to use this term, but let's say spiritually or kind of zeitgeistfully, if that's even a word, of the moment where 1994 Clerks, the Kevin Smith black and white classic indie film, which launched his career and really kind of this popularity of a movie where people really just talked and not a lot of visual camera work went on. But Clerks really foreshadowed this coming self-referential, sarcastic mentality of Generation X, where in that film, some of the best dialogue is about Star Wars, where Randall's talking about how, do you think the people who built the Death Star, the stormtroopers or whoever was building the Death Star, do you think they were part of a union? And when it blew up, do you think that their families got, some kind of compensation, or how were they paid? Where you start to look at something that's just been accepted. Great, Star Wars is a great sci-fi film, but now you start to take this comedic look, you start twisting things around, you start applying a sarcasm, and now you're starting to make fun of these cultural icons. Clerks was really just an amazing example of that, and it really set a tone that kind of Scream applied to the horror slasher genre. So if you haven't seen Clerks, definitely check it out, and it absolutely ties in with the attitude of Scream and what was going on in the mid-90s for Generation Youth. And to maybe see a relative of Scream in today's movies, you have to take a look at Juno. Juno also has this sort of sarcastic, self-referential, cynical kind of attitude. It's written by Diablo Colby, who is about 28, 29, 30, so she would have been about 15, 16 when Scream came out, so that whole independent cinema 90s, Pulp Fiction, Clerks, Scream kind of attitude definitely has filtered into her work. You could just imagine if Juno was in this movie that she would have had the same reactions as Sydney did when she got that first phone call. So let's talk about today. Let's talk about slasher movies, the horror genre, the remakes. Where are we today in terms of creativity and the life cycle of our genres? Let's just take maybe horror movies in general, because within the last 2 or 3 years, remakes have just been flooding the gates. Really, I guess you could say the last 6 years, because Texas Chainsaw Massacre was remade, I believe, in 2003, so it's been about 6 years now. So why are movies being remade instead of original movies being thought of? And really quickly, here's kind of a goofy scene. That might be the goofiest scene of the movie. Okay, so Sydney and Tatum, right? Is that her name here? Tatum are in the store, and they're buying some food for the party, and the ghost face killer mask guy is in the store fully dressed, and we see his reflection on one of the glass doors. That's totally absurd. That might be one of the rare moments of this movie that just totally doesn't work. So that means that this guy in broad daylight put his costume on, followed them into the store, and just kind of watched them. So it's equally as goofy as the bushes. And in terms of a screenwriting analysis, you could kind of see that maybe those scenes were in the original script before the Weinstein brothers gave Kevin Williamson the note to add in the scene where Fonzie is killed. Because it almost seems that in the original draft, or the draft before that Fonzie principal murder happens, that was Kevin Williamson's way of keeping the killer in the audience's mind. Just kind of have him peering in the distance and always just showing up in the background so that we know he's looking at Sydney, but there isn't any on-screen killing going on. Really kind of, those two little moments don't really work. I kind of wish they were taken out and just leave that great moment with the principal being taken out. And just to quickly mention something, we had the scene with Dewey and his chief of police talking about who the suspect could be. That scene has really two little great things going on in it. First, they panned down to show the chief's shoes, his boots, which are exactly like the killer's boots in the bathroom scene, so now he's even added as a possible suspect. And then we have the great comedy going on, the Wes Craven kind of comedic moment where the chief has a cigarette, and Dewey, staying true to his character, right, he's 25, he's kind of naive, and later on he mentions he's a virgin, he's kind of like this, looking for a role model, or, not very sure of himself yet, and he has an ice cream cone, so he's mimicking the exact motions of when the chief takes the cigarette, so that really works on a comedic little level, and it's really very slight. You don't really focus on it, and it's not this hilarious kind of slapsticky, spoofy moment. It's just who the character is, and if you laugh at it, you laugh at it. You might just unconsciously notice it, but it's intentional. It's put there for a reason, so it definitely works. And again, we get another suspect. So It adds to the storyline. And here's the beginning of the end. Now we're at about, let's say, the 1 hour and 2 minute mark. So what is that, 62 minutes? This movie is 111 minutes long. So we still have 50 minutes to go, and we've already arrived at what's going to be the final location of the movie. And this scene here with Gale and Dewey also continues the suspicion that he might be the killer. We've had a lot of good scenes where he's kind of just come in as a murder's happened or as the killer showed up. So he's really a prime suspect. And here we kind of feel that Gale might be threatened. Now, we're not very sympathetic with Gale at the moment. She's kind of coming off as a pretty self-interested biznack. And here we set up a really nice element of the story where it's also kind of a commentary on how technology is just invading everyone's life. And she's given a little video camera feed. She's going to go inside the house, put it on the TV. And it's kind of a little convenient that it has a 30-second delay. Even today, of course, it wouldn't have a 30-second delay. But back then, it really adds to the tension of the story where on these multiple levels, they're watching something on the TV, we're watching them watching something, and then in the van they have the camera on the people who are watching the TV, and we're watching everybody watching everybody. So it's really works in, and Williamson and Craven really worked that dynamic pretty well. A great little reference moment here where you have Neve Campbell sitting on the couch reading through all the classic horror movies, all the classic slasher films. And this scene is really great too because now you have Gale and Sydney, and there's just that dynamic, that history between them, and you never really have that in slasher movies before this, where you put two characters into a room, and the most you might have had in the past was that boyfriend and girlfriend were fighting, or the girl's jealous that the boy's looking at this other girl. You know, it never really got deeper than that. Some movies, maybe like My Bloody Valentine, had this backstory where the guy was trapped in the mine and went insane and all that kind of stuff. Or a movie like Terror Train where it's motivated by a horrible prank that the kids pulled on the nerd, and now the nerd's gone crazy and he's taken everyone out one by one. Sorry to ruin it if you haven't seen it before. But the relationships were pretty much two-dimensional. There was really not a lot of emotion shared between characters. Here we have the Rose McGowan garage kill coming up. This is another great little addition to the lexicon of the slasher genre where you always have to ask, okay, no matter what the movie is, who the killer is, what haven't we seen before? Now, this movie, again, is filled with opportunities of turning cliches on their head. They've established a new look for a killer, and we have his prime weapon, which is the knife. And his method of killing is really brutal, and this movie shows everything. And that kind of went out of favor towards the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s, where in the 70s and 80s, these movies really showed everything, and they didn't hold back. But as that genre life cycle moved more and more towards parodying itself, you had Freddy Krueger come up, and he was basically like a stand-up comedian killer, making all these jokes as he's taking out his victims. So the scares or the goriness of the genre kind of gave way to the more humor-filled moments, and they just implied the stabbing and the blood and all this kind of stuff. Of course, you had moments that really stood out, decapitations and things like that, but nowhere near the level of the 80s and late 70s. So here, this movie, especially with the Drew Barrymore scene that just opens up with her being gutted and we just see her stabbed and the camera does not cut away, this really kind of took back that brutality of the original slasher genre. And here again, this is basically like the Juno-ish kind of sarcastic character where she doesn't believe that he's the killer. And wait, here's the great line coming up. Let's hold on just a second. Can I be the helpless victim? That's a great line. Please don't kill me, Mr. Ghostface. I want to be in the sequel. So another perfect example of these kids being so aware of all the movie rules. And then that kind of funny, sarcastic moment is balanced off with just this real horror where he takes the knife out and the camera does not cut away. We see the cut on the arm and the blood. And here again, this killer's vulnerable. She hits him with the fridge door, and she's going to start throwing the beer bottles at him, and they're breaking. I think they're breaking a little bit too easy. I don't know if a beer bottle against a person would shatter so easily. But here we have one of the more shocking kills of the movie where she squeezes through. But she makes it seem a little bit tougher than it looks. I don't know if you're in that situation, you might hustle a little bit more, but whatever. We need to have this kill, and this is totally original. You never really have seen anything like this before in any at least popular horror film. And there's going to be a pretty nasty quick cut. It's maybe, let's say, 24 frames for 1 second. It's probably 12 frames. Very fast where her face smashes right here. Pretty gory. Oh, there we go. It looks very rubbery, but we get the point of it. It's pretty horrific. And who knows if her garage door could actually lift that much weight, but let's not ask too many questions. It's just a fun time, right? But her dying was a shock because she's one of the main characters. She's someone who we think might survive till the end. But maybe we don't, because up to this point, Scream is just destroying all of our expectations, so of course she should die. Everyone should die in this movie. There's still, I remember seeing this in the theater and seeing with a couple friends, and afterwards talking about it, and everyone really thought that everyone was going to die in this film, that the killers would survive, because Scream was just destroying every expectation. That the expectation became that the logical way to kind of go to the end of this extreme of every single horror cliche, slasher movie cliche needs to be turned on its head is that the main heroine won't survive. Maybe the killer even won't. Everyone will be dead. So, and again, that was a pretty exciting thing. And Jamie Kennedy shows up, so let's finish some thoughts about his scene in the video store with the two killers, who we'll soon find out are the killers, and how he's very self-referential in terms of talking about a horror movie, and he's in a horror movie, but of course he doesn't know he's in one. But he starts referencing how everyone's a suspect, and he knows all the different horror movies. People are asking him, okay, where can I find this Howling movie and all this kind of stuff. So he in the movie is the most knowledgeable person about the horror genre, the slasher genre, and that makes him one of the prime suspects. So again, another great example of making us think that Dewey could be the killer, Sydney's father, who we haven't seen the whole movie, could be the killer, her boyfriend Billy. Anybody in here can pretty much be the suspect, especially Jamie Kennedy. And that's just a great scene because he's talking about the horror movie rules. And here we have the full extension of that, probably the most popular moment of the movie, where he gets up in front of everyone as they're watching Halloween, which is so great that we're watching Halloween, which is, of course, the grandfather, the original, let's call it the missing link, or one of the first DNA bloodline relatives of creating the slasher genre. And it's taking place within a movie that is redefining and resurrecting the genre that it helped create. It's just one of those moments when you're watching it or in the theater. I just remember thinking, wow, I'm this huge horror fan. I really love this genre. I wish I would have thought of that. That's when you know you have a really great movie and just a great idea when you see it. And, if you're a writer, aspiring writer, director, and you say to yourself, that's such a great idea. I wish I would have thought of it. It's probably the ultimate compliment that you can give to any kind of movie. Wish I would have done that. So here's the scene with Billy and Sydney up in the bedroom, and she's going to lose her virginity at the same time Jamie Kennedy's character is talking about the rules to surviving a slasher movie, one of which are the virgin will survive. So if you have sex in a slasher movie, your character is going to die. And this is great too because Billy references Silence of the Lambs, and later he's going to reference a line from Psycho, Norman Bates. So this movie's also commenting on how just movies in general, and maybe just this whole entertainment attack of all the different media, that we're becoming just these creatures of story, where we've seen so many stories in so many different places that we aren't really creating our own reality anymore. We're just kind of comparing it with what's happened on screen, where if you're in a situation, you can say, oh, that reminds me of this movie, or that's what this character said in this movie. So it's also a comment on just how pop culture, especially movies, stories, these blockbuster stories that just permeate our consciousness, they really kind of take us over. And that leads to another discussion which is addressed here, and these characters really brilliantly talk about it later, where the idea of do horror movies, do violent films, create violent people, or do they make them more creative? That's one of the lines here. Great line. So, and that's what Wes Craven has had a history of battling against, like the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPAA, who rates the movies and censors the artist. So, at what point, if you're making a violent film, a horror movie, do you take responsibility for saying, well, this can or does add to violence in society? And it's great because this movie basically hints at it. The characters towards the end talk about it a lot, but it's just there. It's there if you want to talk about it. It's there if you want to see it in a movie. And again, that's just another great example. When you have a great filmmaker, a great writer, and just some good ideas in a movie, you can find all these different levels if you want to look for them, because they're there. Let's get back to the discussion about today's horror genre and all the mini genres within it, whether it's slasher, J-horror, torture porn. But let's get interrupted again, because we're going to have another great moment from the movie interrupt us, where Jamie Kennedy finally gets up and explains all of the rules. Now, remember that this was 1996. Bulletin board, internet, chat room kind of stuff was just really starting to explode. AOL was starting to connect everyone, and there was definitely nowhere near the level of connectivity today, especially with these various video host sharing sites where you can comment on things and send people videos and clips, where you can go to any site now and search for a clip from any movie and you can pretty much be assured to find it. Someone's posted it. Everything is literally at the tip of your fingers. All you need to do is think about it, and within a minute you can be watching it. It's amazing. Back then, to have the rules summarized like this was kind of something new. No one really had done this before. And if they had, it wasn't posted anywhere on the internet or any place where it could be passed from person to person. So that was another advantage that this movie had. It just came out at the right time, and it did something that all of us wish we would have done. Because we all know these rules. We've seen these movies 100 times. So for someone to come along and say, hey, I'm just going to collect all these rules and now I'm going to spoof them, was just such a genius move. So this scene here is basically like the visual little bulletin board blog post that we would have nowadays. And this list he gives in today's world, if this was made in a movie today and this character gets up and says, hey, here are all these rules of the genre, we would be sitting in the audience thinking, yeah, dude, I got that email last week too. It's just such a common occurrence that every day you get these forwarded little things in the emails or text messages where things like this are happening all the time. So it's very commonplace. But back then, this just kind of captured it right before it would have became mundane. So it was sort of a fresh new thing that, wow, someone actually thought about horror movies, gave us this list, and now they're going to tell us exactly what they're going to be spoofing. Here we cut back to the scene in the bedroom with Billy and Sydney, and she is officially going to become a victim in the slasher genre. She's going to open herself up for becoming a victim. And this is some great parallel storytelling where upstairs you have the cliche sex scene in a horror movie, in a slasher film, and downstairs they're watching a classic slasher sex scene from Halloween, and it's a scene of nudity, but they cut away from it, and here they cut back upstairs, and we have Billy's shoulder blocking what would have been one of the cliche genre set pieces of a slasher film. Then when it cuts back downstairs, the phone rings, and this movie's done such a good job of making us scared of the telephone that when it rings, we jump and we're thinking, uh-oh, the killer's calling him. But of course, it's not that, it's a little twist, and Fonzie's body is hanging somewhere on the goalpost, so everyone is going to leave the house, leaving Jamie Kennedy, Sydney, Billy, and only a few other characters around, and we're going to have our final few sequences here, and so let's take this moment to try to sneak in a discussion about today's horror world and the need for a Scream. I think this is the great time to be talking about Scream because, again, just like in the mid-90s, horror slasher movies had become stale. Today it seems like more than just horror movies are becoming stale. But if we could just stick with the horror genre, why are we having so many remakes now? There was a really interesting comment by Steven Spielberg at the Golden Globes when he got the Cecil B. DeMille Lifetime Achievement Award, and he talked about how in the tough economic times there's this tendency for Hollywood, for the studios, to play it really safe, to go with projects that are going to be guaranteed to have cash. He didn't go into it this much, or he just kind of mentioned it, basically saying that something along the lines of, I hope we can still have the bravery or the guts to make stories that aren't guaranteed to make money, something to that effect. And you can see that going on right now, and it really started at the beginning of this decade when you had all these just massive adaptations of Lord of the Rings and just comic books. You know, we're basically living in the decade of the comic book adaptation and book adaptation, and alongside that you have the remake craze going on. But all of this adds up to basically Hollywood sticking with properties that have been proven to draw audiences, whether it's a classic book like Lord of the Rings, which has been around for 50, 60 years, and there's definitely a strong fan base for that, or it's the Star Wars prequel trilogy, which of course everyone, even beyond Geek Nation, wants to see or wanted to see. And then of course comic book craziness, which was opened up by the groundbreaking effects of The Matrix. So you have X-Men, Spider-Man, you just name it, it's all already been done, or whatever's left over is about to be done. All of this basically adds up to movies that are made based on projects and ideas that already exist. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, because Lord of the Rings on the big screen, great. And what's even better about that is they got an amazing filmmaker to realize it. They did something very risky, which was give him money to make the trilogy all at once, which he did, and it seemed like a very careless investment, giving over $150 million, almost $200 million, to make 3 movies, which by today's standards isn't that much. The new Transformers movie by itself is costing $200 million. And we have to stop our discussion again. Sorry. Because we cut back to Billy and Sydney, and here we have her putting together some clues that maybe were overlooked earlier in the movie, and she's going to start to suspect that Billy may just be the killer, and this is going to lead to what's pretty much a non-stop chase to the end of the movie. So we are at about an hour and 20 minutes into the movie, so we have another half hour to go, and it's pretty relentless from this point on. It's chase and tension, a little bit of blood, some gore, violence, of course more references and hipster talk. But what's great about this moment here is that the killer shows up with Billy inside the room, so we're thinking, okay, for sure Billy's not the killer. And he basically predicts his own death here in a very hip, kind of sarcastic way, where he says, what do I have to do to prove that I'm not the killer? Well, one way you can prove that you're not the killer is to be killed, which happens in just a couple seconds. So she runs out, and we have a great little chase. So, okay, while that's going on, let's return to this discussion. So Hollywood, they have been successful by playing it safe. It's not a 100% safe zone, because there's really no guarantee in Hollywood that if you adapt anything, even if it has 1 million readers, 1 million copies of a book, that there's no total guarantee it's going to draw an audience for it. But there's a likelihood it will. I mean, Harry Potter is a huge success in terms of movie box office because it's a huge success with its reader base, with its selling of books. So if you can get a hold of properties like that, you're guaranteed to make the cash. So after what is now 9 years of kind of being spoiled by having all these trilogies and adaptations, which occasionally fail, like The Golden Compass or the sequel to Chronicles of Narnia, eventually we get burned out on those things. But why not just play it safe instead of thinking of something totally original? But then on the other hand, adapting X-Men and all that is great because it's such great source material. It deserves to be seen on screen in a live-action format, and we're finally living in the age where all that can be done. So it's been really a dream to see Spider-Man and X-Men and Lord of the Rings and all these different stories come into the third dimension. And most importantly, when great filmmakers have been behind these projects, they've been pretty much flawless. Just totally 5-star, great, great, great movies. Bryan Singer with the X-Men, Sam Raimi with Spider-Man. Totally awesome. So original ideas are created in all different mediums, whether it's a TV show or a play or a comic book. As long as it's original, it's something unique. More power to Hollywood for making it, but as long as they make it right, as long as they respect it, respect us, the audience, who are the ones that made it popular in the first place, whether it's Harry Potter or whether it's Confessions of a Shopaholic or something. He's just not that into you. If we made that popular, then respect us and what we loved about it. Try to find that thing that made it connect with us and just translate that to the big screen instead of just going with the title and thinking that the name is going to draw the crowd instead of with the content. And this is a great scene here. Let's just interrupt this real quick. Jamie Kennedy on the bed, he's drunk, and the camera's also kind of tilted in this drunk mode. And on the TV, he's watching a scene where Jamie Lee Curtis is being stalked by Michael Myers, and he keeps saying, "Look behind you," while Ghostface is behind him, and then cut to the van where the guy's going to be watching the video camera feed of Jamie Kennedy with Ghostface behind him as he's watching Jamie Lee Curtis with Michael Myers behind her. So there's this great multi-level thing, and we're watching him, watching her. So there's just this shadow effect of the same scene being repeated, and you can almost feel like we in the audience, someone should be telling us, "Look behind you, there's a killer in the audience," which Scream 2 does later on. And here's where the tape delay comes into play. We have the guy get out of the car, and it's 30-second delay, boom, and it's pretty gory. A slash to the throat. And then there's a little sequence here. It's so simple, just the whole being chased through the van, and then when she gets into the police car, and Ghostface has the keys, and it's just a battle of pushing on the locks. And he opens it on one side, she goes there, he opens it on the other. And it's just a very simple sort of tense little device. Great, great idea. Okay, now to return quickly to this, back to our idea about Hollywood taking the easy road to making movies. I'm in favor of movies being made from material based in any kind of medium, whether it's a radio play, theater, book, whatever. As long as it's original, as long as it's maybe in touch with our current times, saying something new, or saying something old but in a new, different way that applies to us today. So familiar isn't bad as long as it's creative. Can you find a new way to say something old? Now we're in a weird moment in time in terms of movies because all the major products, especially in the comic book world, that had a huge audience, that were waiting for technology to be developed which could faithfully and realistically bring it to the big screen, all that's happened. We're past that. So where do we go from here? Where are they going to come from? And especially for film, when you look at screenplays that are purchased or properties that are purchased to be made into movies later, over 80 to 85%, probably 90% of the movies that come out are based on something else. There's only a small percentage, 10% or so, which could be called original screenplays, which are not based on something else and specifically written as original stories in the screenplay format. That's very risky because, again, you have no way of knowing how this work is going to do in terms of an audience because it doesn't exist in any other kind of medium. It hasn't been tested, and an audience hasn't responded by saying, "Wow, here, give it," if it's a book, "I love this product, it's an awesome story, it's a bestseller, it's made $1 million, millions of dollars." What's $1 million today? It's nothing. But it's made hundreds of millions of dollars, so we absolutely want to make that into a movie. If it's an original screenplay, there's no guarantee. A great example that recently happened is Christopher Nolan, right? The Dark Knight, director of, has written an original screenplay called Inception, which is supposed to be a sci-fi movie that takes place within the architecture of the mind, as he describes it. Now, the only reason he got the green light to make that movie is because he made the 2 previous Batman movies, and especially The Dark Knight, which was an amazing billion-dollar hit. So once you do that, the studio is going to cut you some slack, especially since he's basically got them held hostage. If the news came out that Christopher Nolan would not be directing the 3rd Batman movie, you can pretty much be guaranteed that the fan base would really second guess if they would see the third installment. So it really takes a lot of clout to get an original screenplay made. The only kind of automatic, let's say, road that an original screenplay would take to get greenlit would be that if it was something so amazing, something so original, something so obvious that needed to be said, then it would really get attention, which was what Scream was. Scream was an original screenplay, and it just turned slasher genre on its head and was really fast-tracked into being made because, again, it had that original voice. That's something that needed to be said, that needed to be done for the health, for the resurrection of this genre, which is where we are today, again, where we've discussed the motivation behind greenlighting projects, especially if they're adapted and based on something else. But now, once those genres, once those projects start coming out, whether it's, let's call it the superhero comic book genre, whether it's, again, the J-horror, torture porn genre, maybe the action movie genre, they're eventually going to run dry. There's been so many of them, the conventions have been followed. It's time for the rejuvenation to take place. The question now is it going to take place? Oh, really quick, awesome scene here, as mentioned before. Sidney is in the car and the killer has the keys. This is kind of a rare example of a very smart killer. Now, when you have Jason or Michael Myers, they have a level of intelligence to them, but they're basically kind of a little bit smarter than zombies. They kind of just have their one little kill, 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 and they walk and they pop out of places. When you get to Freddy, he's definitely maybe the most creative of all the slashers because he's working within the dream world, so he has to know your fears and prey on them. He might be the most creative example. And other lesser slasher guys like the miner from My Bloody Valentine or the conductor kind of clown guy from Terror Train. I mean, they're people, but there's nothing overly unique about them. They're just pissed off, they have a grudge, and they're going to find a way to get their revenge. This killer here likes to play these games because, as we're going to find out, it's two teenagers, two high schoolers who have seen way too many horror movies, and they're kind of playing off of these conventions of previous slasher films, and they're having fun with their victims and doing this kind of pantomime with the knife and all this. And also, got to mention this little detail that the killer here does, that every time he kills a victim, he like takes his cloak or his glove and he wipes the blood off to make it shiny again. It's just a nice little detail. It probably gets looked over a lot, but it really adds something to the killer, because we don't know, again, that it's the teenagers yet, so it can be anybody, and it just makes us second guess and think, wow, what's going through that person's mind. Here's another great scene where Sidney has to choose between the two characters, which one's the killer. And in the classic horror movie or thriller situations, this comes down to a choice of, let's look at these two people and look for a little clue that's going to tell me, oh, I recognize that from the killer. But no, in this situation, she does this cool, hip kind of Generation X thing where she's like, screw both of you, close the door, you guys can, fight amongst yourselves. So that awesome, great moment. Love it, and very unexpected, and in the theater that got a really big laugh. And here we have Billy come down, and we're about to get our reveal where he's opening the door, and that's just a tense moment, and a little jolt there where Jamie Kennedy comes through. And now he's going to turn around and shoot him, and we're officially going to enter the last sequence or two of our movie here. She knows who the killer is finally revealed, and now she has to find a way to survive. And here we kind of get the final sort of thesis of the movie, of Kevin Williamson's breakdown, deconstruction of the slasher genre, where Billy's going to do the Norman Bates quote, and they're going to start revealing all the different cliche predictable endings of the movies where the victim always wants the motivation of the killer to find out what happened, where if you have films like Terror Train or Prom Night, it's because something happened years earlier. My Bloody Valentine, same thing. And I'm trying to think of another horror movie or just a story in general where the killer, the mystery person, has been revealed to be two people. I can't really think of it right now. I'm sure it's happened before, but obviously it hasn't happened in such a popular kind of pop culture, stuck in our memory kind of a way, so that it feels it's fresh. I know there's an Alfred Hitchcock film from 1948 called Rope, where his main experiment in the movie was to see if he can film everything in one unbroken take. He kind of cheated it by doing it in 10-minute segments because I guess the film in the canister could only record 10 minutes at a time. And it was basically a play where it's kind of one location, but it was based on these historic Loeb and Leopold murders where these two young guys, I don't know if they killed a bunch of people, but at least one or two murders. And they were young and smart and no one suspected them, and they turned out to be experimenting with getting away with murder. So two male characters based on a actual events story. So that was done what's now 60 years ago, and at the time of Scream it was about 40 years before. And then in a couple years after this, in 1998 I want to say, 1999, there was of course Funny Games, which was recently remade in English by the same director, pretty much shot for shot, but that also dealt with really breaking down the conventions of violence in a movie, and it had two males as the main killers, but it wasn't a suspenseful kind of mystery thing where you didn't know who it was going to be to the end. In that movie, you know pretty much off the bat, but it's another example of two male main character killers. So we have Billy breaking it down for Sydney, telling her everything she's wanted to know about what the motivations for, at least his motivations are. For the Matthew Lillard character, that's a sign there. I just watched this movie the other day, and I don't remember the Matthew Lillard character, his name. Now maybe that's because I just have a bad memory, or he didn't really stand out as much as he should have. Or that Billy's character was developed a little bit more. So here we have a great, great little final moment here where they've kind of made this plan up of how, based on the movies they've seen, and again, it's a whole knocking of the cliche of these horror movies where all they say is they have to just watch the movies, take some notes, and you'd be amazed how easy it is to frame someone for this. They've actually had the father the whole time, and they're going to, of course, kill the father, kill Sydney, and then stab each other. And they're going to be the survivors, and they can make up whatever story they want. Now, that's the real shocking part, is when they start stabbing each other. Because at this point, in 1996, I know, talking about it with my friends, we couldn't remember any kind of movie where the characters act like that. It's like, wow, these kids are really, really effed up. And it just really shocked us. So the movie started out with a big shock with killing off Drew Barrymore. And here, it just adds to that with these characters really going at each other. And they're so crazy that they're kind of unaware of exactly how much damage they could do to each other when they do stab each other. On the commentary for this movie, Wes Craven talks about, in his mind, these characters have only been locked in like this film world. They've only seen murders and violence on TV. So when it actually happens to them, they really can't understand what it is until that knife goes through. And once it happens, they seem to kind of snap, where especially Billy, he's got all this rage, tries to justify it with his mother leaving, but he really cuts into Matthew Lillard's character a little bit too much. And this is really genius in a very twisted way in terms of Kevin Williamson's imagination. So while up to this point the movie really destroys a lot of previous cliches and twists our expectations around to make it really enjoyable, the end here kind of falls back into predictability, but it's more of a commentary than a let's call it a laziness in terms of the story, because you have Gail show up with the gun, and then Billy, of course, is laying on the ground later, and it's like, okay, this is the part where the killer has his last chance to come back to life and kill everyone off. So it all happens according to the previous plan, but it doesn't seem like it's a lack of originality in terms of the screenplay part. It's more of a kind of a homage of, okay, here's kind of how they end. So let's return to the discussion about how can today's movies be revitalized, or is that even possible? Because you can look back at 1996, I guess we're going to pause on our discussion today again, but looking when Scream came out, it really just kind of rocked the world, right? It's the Pulp Fiction of the slasher genre, just like turns everything around and just shocks all the conventions. And now as a result, what happens, right? That's, in terms of the genre life cycle, Scream was that phase one, that step one. Something new, original, different comes out and creates a new set of genre guidelines. So what's going to happen? Well, step two. it's an inevitable part, this kind of cycle. It has to go down this certain road. So Scream comes out and it redefines things. Now the second phase happens where now the copycats come out. So you're going to have all these self-referencing, aware characters, very sarcastic, very hip in these horror movies. So you have urban legends and I Know What You Did Last Summer. So again, we're trapped in this, now Hollywood's going to reproduce everything, and then those are going to get tired, and the slasher genre is going to fade away yet again, but this version of the slasher genre, so it does. And after 1999, 2000, 2001, it takes a little bit of a break until Saw and Hostel come along, The Ring and The Grudge, and we move away from slasher horror back into a little bit of a new phase, something original. So those original ideas come out, and the cycle starts yet again. Really quickly, a great moment here when Gail's holding the gun, and she's, again, being aware of the horror genre. She's talking about rewriting the ending that these two killers had written, where the reporter foils their plans, but the safety doesn't work. So a little bit of a nice twist there, and it seems like these killers are going to get away with it. Okay, so back to our discussion. So it seems like no matter how original, how creative any new idea is, it's going to be subject to being copied, burned out, and eventually dying. And I, for one, actually don't mind that. I think the big thing here is that each generation, each culture creates its own variations on a genre. So let's say in the last 5 years, again, the Saw and Hostel movies have created like pornography or torture porn. We had J-horror be very popular, so that was at least a new spin on these old genres. Now we have something going on with these remakes. Now, in the past, remakes have always happened, but they haven't happened this frequently, and this assembly line planned. And the major genre that's really a victim of the remake is the horror genre. And especially now with the recent Friday the 13th remake just taking in insane box office amounts, it's only going to encourage more raping of the Hollywood past, of the movie dead. And this is an awesome moment of the movie here where Sydney now has turned their game on them, where she's calling them with the voice box and making the threats, and things are out of control for them. And Matthew Lillard has this great line where he says, "My mom's going to be so mad at me because she's going to find out what I did." Just really, really funny. And another example of the characters not taking their situation so seriously. When you go back to previous horror movies, all the characters are so serious. It's so spooky. And oh my God, someone out there. And here you have everyone aware of, hey, I've seen so many movies like this. I've seen so many situations here where I already know what's going to happen, or they're already thinking about these things. So that's just a whole new level again for taking characters in these type of movies. So to finish up with our discussion of the current movie crisis, if you want to be as dramatic as that to call it a crisis, hopefully you've been able to kind of keep track of this back and forth discussion. It keeps getting interrupted by different trains of thoughts here. But basically, there is really no way to prevent kind of the life cycle of genres in terms of a new idea comes out, it's going to be copied, it's going to burn out, everyone's going to get tired of it, and it's probably going to become irrelevant and die off. Unless, again, there's some kind of refreshing twist, which Scream is a great example of for the slasher movie. So, in today's movie atmosphere, it just seems that there's less of this rejuvenation happening, where the focus, as discussed before, is about just kind of having these products that are almost guaranteed to make money, just kind of putting your bets on the strongest horse, the one that looks like it's going to finish first, and not taking a risk on the underdog. So that's where the original screenplay idea comes in, where you have to be Christopher Nolan or James Cameron or someone with a little bit of clout and a proven track record to get that kind of freedom to just come up with your own ideas. So we're in kind of a tough time. It's gotten tougher as the years have passed. If you go back to the 70s and early 80s, it was probably a little bit easier to get something more original made. And even in the early 90s with the independent cinema kind of boom, it was really the kind of the in thing to have the unpredictable movie come out. As mentioned before with like a Clerks or anything with Kevin Smith, Quentin Tarantino, with Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. Those obviously were not based on anything that had come out before. You could say that Quentin Tarantino is kind of doing like a mishmash of his favorite films, his genres from kind of his childhood, and we all know the story of him working in a video store when he was like 25, 26, and just watching movies nonstop. So maybe he just kind of edited together just favorite classic moments of his own personal video collection and made movies out of it. But as much as you want to try to knock him, he definitely has skills, and he made those old ideas, those old scenes from other movies seem fresh and new and put his own spin on them. So that spirit doesn't seem to be alive anymore, and it's very much just, let's just do the safest thing possible today. In terms of remakes for the horror films, they're obviously going to be happening. They've been getting rewarded at the theater, which is a big part of the problem. And when the rewards come, they're just going to continue to listen to that feedback. You know, our box office dollars are our votes. You know, they're our ballot that we cast when we walk into the voting booth of the movie theater. So the one that gets the most votes, the one that gets the most box office is the one that wins out, and those kind of movies are going to be made more and more. Hopefully there will be a little more inspiration, especially now that there's just so many avenues for entertainment to kind of enter the public consciousness. For what the independent 90s cinema was with Sundance. The Sundance Film Festival was basically like, let's say, the internet of the early 90s, where the independent, aspiring, passionate filmmakers would go. You know, they put all these movies on their credit cards, asked family members for money, and that's where they went to just have that chance to achieve their dreams. Hopefully now costs are down, availability of equipment is up, and everyone can just sign up for an account on whatever kind of video hosting site, and all it takes is just a great idea done well enough to just get 5 million hits, 10 million hits, grab some kind of audience, get a bunch of subscribers, and hopefully some careers can be launched and maybe some freshness can be added. So that's the lifeblood of the movie business, not the already established kind of cemented into their position higher ups or even the well-established filmmakers, because they're kind of part of the system now. You need those unpredictable, out of nowhere talented artists to kind of just come up with their own ideas, to see the world through a fresh perspective that doesn't involve accounting numbers and marketing, and to just come out with an idea that really touches the heart of society, or people that people can relate to and that people are waiting for, instead of these just really manipulated, tested numbers where it's like, okay, well, this movie made this much kind of money and it was family based and it had these kind of characters, so let's make another movie that's like that. You know, that's really not the ideal way to tell stories. You got to tell stories based on kind of the mood of the times and what people are feeling and the dreams of those times and what we want to see happen in the future. So stories are definitely a powerful tool that deserve to be respected, and they're also a powerful way to make money, which has been revealed over the last 100 years since the existence of movies. I just talked over the end of the movie here, which was a pretty, not so predictable, but you kind of saw it coming, where the killer, of course, has to have that last leap, that last try to get the heroine and everyone else. So Billy and Matthew Lillard are killed, and we have some survivors. So there's obviously going to be a sequel, and here again is the genius of the whole Scream idea, because sequels are an automatic part of the slasher genre. So now part 2 has just all this other material to work with in terms of the rules of a horror sequel, of a slasher sequel. And it just opened itself up for commenting more on all of those just already established situations and genre set pieces of the slasher sequel. So Scream 2 really does a great job also. But by the time of Scream 3, it's kind of in a weird spot, because it's still commenting on the sequelization of slasher movies and the marketing and the whole idea of just constantly making sequels to get more and more money, and the quality of slasher movies kind of, going down, dissipating with each installment. But Scream 3 kind of also falls into that trap, where by the third one we're kind of burned out on it already. The first one, again, that life cycle. So it's exciting, it's new. As a result, other movies kind of copied its style, and by the time of Scream 3, it's already towards that burnout parody phase. And just as Scream 3 is coming out, Scary Movie is coming out, which, for just a little trivia, the original title of Scream was Scary Movie. And both movies were made by Miramax. So Miramax changed the title of Scary Movie to Scream originally, and then when they decided to spoof the whole genre that kind of Scream revitalized, they decided to call it Scary Movie. So it worked out for Miramax on both ends. But part 3 of Scream kind of fell into that rut. By that time, everyone was just ready for the series to be over. It did make fun of those conventions where basically the rules of slasher sequels are you have to up the body count, you have to reveal an even more ridiculous killer, sort of twist beyond twist, where it's a brother of a sister of an uncle, who's really the killer. So, and then characters who survived the original sequel start dying. So Friday the 13th Part 2 obviously is most famous for that, where you have the girl who chops off Jason's mother's head in the opening sequence of that, and Jason ice picks her, so he gets his revenge and establishes the horror genre set piece pattern. But interestingly enough, Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween 2 didn't die. She actually didn't die until much later. I forget, I think it's Halloween 6 or 7, but by then we really didn't care, and it was kind of lame. So let's hope that this current environment that we're in can have some Scream moments, can have at least that movie or that filmmaker, someone that comes along and gives us a little bit of jolt of creativity. Of course it's going to be copied, but that's okay. As long as this new, fresh, imaginative kind of inspiration comes in, let that be copied. That's actually a good thing. Of course it'll be taken to an extreme level and that original energy will be lost, but at least we'll have a little bit of, I don't know, like a vibrancy, kind of a little bit of more color to our movie complexion for a little while. I know I keep mentioning these movies, but Saw, as much as I'm not a big fan of the torture porn genre in terms of just, the obsession with showing the torture and kind of lingering on all the blood and everything, I like the concept of it, and it was definitely something new, and it made you interested in it. So it just showed that, we're in the 2000s here, and it seems like every decade, every half century, there's always some philosopher, everything that could be done has been done. It's all a repeat. Well, it might be all a repeat, but at least we're putting different faces on the old bodies, if you will. To borrow something from Joseph Campbell, if you haven't gotten into Joseph Campbell at all, really great mythologist of the 1900s, really smart guy, wrote a lot of books. His most famous book is The Hero with a Thousand Faces, with the idea being that the hero is common to all humanity and all cultures, and it's the underlying story of the hero is always there. It's always the same. It has the same pattern, but it's the faces of the hero that changes. Whether it's China, Russia, America, anywhere on the planet, all humans go through the same things. We just have different backgrounds and a different look to us. But at the core, we're all on the same journey. We're on this hero's journey. And just a few final notes about this. This is a really interesting movie. I like to kind of refer to it as the Pulp Fiction of the slasher genre. And it also kind of had a Pulp Fiction-ish effect on the writer, Kevin Williamson, who really kind of rose to stardom very much like Quentin Tarantino. He became this kind of rock star writer. It's a little bit harder for writers to get the respect, but he is a rare example of someone who kind of, got locked into this pop culture consciousness. Maybe the only other writer since Kevin Williamson to achieve that might be Charlie Kaufman, who in the early 2000s, when he wrote Being John Malkovich, kind of became the new hot writer, and all of his movies started getting produced. And maybe most recently, Diablo Cody for Juno. And that's a great thing because it's a female. As much as we like to say that a lot of progress has happened, the female representation of talent behind the camera is not as strong as it should be in terms of directors and writers. In front of the camera, of course, with the acting, but it would be great to kind of mix it up a little bit more. Diversity is a great thing. So Kevin Williamson, huge success, and his career just launched right after this. And 2 years later, he was responsible for another kind of defining cultural little show known as Dawson's Creek. And back then, right, it was on the WB network. And there would be no CW without the WB network, and there would be no WB network without Dawson's Creek, which really kind of cemented it as a teenage viewership kind of place to go. And any of those shows today, Gossip Girl, The OC, 90210, Reboot 2008, right? That's even a remake. Those shows owe their whole kind of attitude and their style to Dawson's Creek. It really opened up just a different way of looking at teens. If you go to shows before Dawson's Creek, you had 90210, Party of Five. Those were starting to break away from the mold of like the 70s and 80s shows. In those days, really, you really didn't have a lot of teenage shows. You had Little House on the Prairie, right? But that was all about the family and All in the Family. Those shows kind of dealt more with the family as a whole. Even Cosby Show, Family Ties, any of those big shows, more focused on adults. If there were kids and teens involved, they were just kind of side stories to the main adult kind of theme of the show. And teens really didn't get their own representation until the 90s, the mid 90s. And then once Dawson's Creek came, it just really kind of redefined this whole teen TV genre with having them just speak dialogue that probably, I started watching Dawson's Creek when I was about 19, I'd say 20, 21 or something. I will admit I did watch like the first 2 seasons of Dawson's Creek only because it had the whole Dawson as an aspiring movie maker aspect to it. So it had that whole situation where the teens were speaking dialogue that was way beyond their years. Even at 21 as I'm watching it, I don't even have that big of a vocabulary. My friends don't have that big of a vocabulary. We're not that self-aware. It's the writers who are in their late 20s and early 30s, and Kevin Williamson, who at that point's like in his mid-30s. It's this self-awareness of a person from an older age looking back on the younger age, incorporating this wisdom, but it also had like this impatience, it's this whole idea that nowadays people at a younger age are actually going to be smarter than their parents were, than their grandparents were. In today's age, there's so much information available, so much experience that you can just watch voyeuristically, so many lessons you can learn from so many different people around you, whether they're real, whether they're your parents or your cousins, or whether they're just characters in a TV show. You can experience humanity in story on so many levels now that just this wisdom, because that's really what story ultimately kind of leads us to. Story is basically just the recorded action of people, and those actions lead to consequences, and those consequences hopefully have a result of wisdom and some kind of knowledge, whether it's a favorable or an unfavorable outcome depending on someone's perspective. But you can have that kind of wisdom. So Dawson's Creek is kind of this part of this wired age of the late 90s where the internet's connecting everyone, and now you're going to be smarter than the people that have come before you. You're going to be more aware of all that. It might not necessarily equal wisdom. It'll definitely equal knowledge and facts, but wisdom is something that comes through personal experience and unfortunately comes with age. So you do have to kind of wait for some wisdom to come. It can't just be a matrix downloaded at the click of a button. So Dawson's Creek, huge cultural impact, as well as Scream in terms of just the consciousness and obviously entertainment. So Kevin Williamson, a rare example of someone who was able to influence his society, the artist influencing society on two major levels, on the television angle with Dawson's Creek and in the movies with Scream. Really, we are living in a time where both of these kind of landmarks, the ripples are still being felt. They kind of go back to this moment in time, the late 90s, with the attitudes and the zeitgeist and everything. And Scream and Dawson's Creek kind of captured those two different forms that were floating around, waiting for someone to translate them for us. So I think that's it. The movie's been over for about 5 or 10 minutes, so thanks for hanging around a little bit longer. If there's any things I think of later, I'll just throw them in the comments section. But please let me have your feedback. Leave some comments in the comments area or email me. And let's just hope together that this independent spirit of times that kind of allowed Scream to exist can be found today. When you had people like the Weinstein brothers, and just that overall 90s indie film environment, that excitement of looking for the next thing, the next interesting idea that would challenge the already established rules of Hollywood at that time. Because today we seem to be conforming more to what's the safest bet. And it's understandable. The stock market, as I'm recording this, it's like at 7,500, right? Its lowest level in a couple months since October. And before that, it's been like 2 years. So we're definitely in some shaky times, so we can understand businesses wanting to stay afloat. But the tricky part about story is that at least I'm a big believer in this, is that humans need story. There's a great writer named Milan Kundera, who is a Czechoslovakian writer, and his most famous book is The Unbearable Lightness of Being. It's from somewhere in the 80s, mid-80s, and there was a movie made about it, adaptation, I believe in the early 90s. And he had this idea about story is an exploration of the possibility of human potential. There's a lot of things that we're not going to be able to achieve in our lifetimes, whether it's just because, we're not the super spy, or we're not living a certain lifestyle that allows us to experience the different levels or the different aspects of humanity. We can't be a police officer, a fireman, a CIA agent, and a stripper all at the same time. Different people are going to experience these different levels of humanity. So story is a way to explore this. And in a way, story is a way for us to learn more about humanity. So hopefully we're creating real people in these stories and allowing them to explore the different aspects of being human. And as a result, hopefully we're entertained, we're having a good time, but we're also learning something. Because that's really what we go to story for. Back in the days when there was no written word, verbal stories were told, and back in those days, those stories had a lot of wisdom. Iliad and the Odyssey, I believe, was first an oral poem. So it's just a need within us to learn from other people, to learn about what we have to do, what's come before, and what is going to be. So that's the end of my rant. That's the end of my philosophizing. So I'm going to step off the movie soapbox, but we'll mention one last thing. I promise this is the last thing. It has just been announced that Scream 4 is going to be made. So I don't know what that says. Scream, again, started out as kind of a brave film with something to say, a little sarcastic angle to take on what's come before, and now it seems like it's part of this whole idea of playing it safe, going back to old franchises, established names so that people recognize it, and the box office can be guaranteed. Hopefully Scream will pick up on this and comment on that, but it's been 13 years since the last one, not since the first one, and I don't really remember when Scream Part 3 came out. I want to say it was maybe 2000, 1999, 2000, 2001. So it's been about 6, 7, 8 years, and they're pulling it back from the dead because they need to make some easy money. But hopefully Wes Craven, Kevin Williamson, and everyone involved, the original cast is supposed to come back for this. At least those who survived. And hopefully they'll have something to say and comment about these times. Maybe in these times the best Scream we can have is a new Scream. So hopefully they'll pick up on it. Okay, so until next movie night, which will be in 2 weeks. Today is February 18th, and look for the next movie night to take place around March 3rd, which will be a Wednesday, and that will be The Dark Knight. A complete 3-hour commentary on the excellent genre-changing, again, that could be considered the Scream of the comic book superhero movie, where it really challenged a lot of the conventions. So we'll talk about that in that movie night for The Dark Knight. Okay, so you guys take care, choose your movies wisely, and as always, long live good movies. Copyright, themoviepreviewcritic.com, 2009.